Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of Figma Decal. Today we'll be talking about pen tool and vectors. Today was President's Day, so we didn't have class in person. So that's why I am in this room and not in Jacob's 310, and why there's not going to be any kind of live questions and things like that. So today we're going to be talking, in addition to pen tool and vectors, about user research and user testing, along with some other parts of the vector edit mode in Figma called masking and Booleans. If you're an enrolled student, you can do attendance by following this link or scanning the QR code. The link is bit.ly/FD Sp23 lec4. And you can access the slide deck here at bit.ly/Figma Decal lec4. We've mentioned this in a couple of the previous recordings, but some of these slides might be a little bit different because we're operating on a slightly older version of the slides than what you see today. So some things like demos and wording might be a little bit different. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started with user research. So user research is all about finding where problems exist and figuring out how to solve user needs. So user research is essentially the way that designers understand behaviors, needs, wants, and motivations of users. It's the way that they obviously do research to figure out what it is that they need to create. We do this mainly through empathy, empathizing with users and understanding what needs are not currently being met. Good user research helps designers to pinpoint problems and create relevant solutions. And again, that idea of empathy is the most important part of conducting any kind of user research. You want to find their pain points, which we'll discuss in a little bit, and ensure that the work that you are doing is responding to actual pain points and actual problems that people have. A lot of the times, if you're designing for a group of people that you might not necessarily be part of, you might be inclined to think that they have certain problems without actually going in and asking and finding out and doing the work of that. It's important to make sure that you're not solving things that don't need to be solved. You know, the whole idea of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So some main methods of user research that you can or implement in your own kind of design work in this class or beyond this class are surveys, which you have probably done a survey before, forms that our users are asked to fill out and are helpful if you need to get a large amount of quantitative data. So quantitative data in that it's often numerical or something that's easy to extrapolate over a really large data set. And survey is something that you can have sent out to quite a lot of people for very little time. Interviews are a little bit more in depth. They're more one-on-one, where you can interact with a specific person or a specific group of people and have direct contact with them. You can ask them questions. You can ask for more feedback on certain things that you're looking to learn about. And you can collect more qualitative data in the sense that it is more descriptive. It's more information, feedback, words, emotions, feelings, the kind of things that you can't necessarily capture in a survey or with numbers. Another method that you could do is contextual inquiry, where you observe people operating within a natural and typical context. So say that I was trying to do user research on a project about the movement of people through the UC Berkeley campus. One way that I could figure out some of the user research for this and figure out what people's problems are would be to just observe what it's like to be on campus on a busy day, say at say their gate or anywhere on Sproul. I can see students who are moving more quickly, who are being flyered, who are on their phones, how many people are listening to music, how many people are trying to find another person, how many people are there at different times of the day. All of that is part of contextual inquiry. So I've mentioned the word pain points a couple of times now, and you can kind of get the sense of what it might mean, but pain points are essentially bugs or problems that users face when their experiences do not align with their expectations. So here we have a kind of idea of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you often see in psychology, starting with the idea of basic needs, things that everybody must have to survive, like food, water, warmth, and rest, going all the way up to the idea of esteem and self-actualization. Bugs and pain points can fall at any point in this kind of pyramid, but a lot of the times, the lower the problem is, the harder it can kind of be to solve or to figure out something that is going to be a secure solution for everybody. But in spotting pain points, you're going to be able to start figuring out what are the actual problems that this user group or this group of people that you're designing with is actually facing, and how do we describe it? How do we understand the problem? In order to figure out a solution, you need to understand the problem front to back. So examples of a couple of pain points that you might see in your day-to-day life. We're going to be focusing more on things that are kind of digital, given that's the kind of software that Figma is. First is no internet. So I'm, for example, doing this from home right now. If I were to be not having access to the internet, it would be very difficult for me to deliver this content to you right now. You are probably also watching this while on the internet. If you are, say, trying to prepare for lab that's coming up this Wednesday and you don't have internet and you can't watch this recording, it would hinder your experience to learn in this class and your ability to take part in the courses that you have at school. Um, Obviously, this is an issue on the Berkeley campus a lot. We frequently have spots where the internet is bad or just not working at a certain point in the day. So this is a major pain point for a lot of UC Berkeley students. Another one that I personally face a lot is bad live time tracking for things like transit. I miss the bus, 4 or 5 times a week, and it's always really difficult to know exactly when the bus is coming when we don't have good live tracking for this kind of thing. It's a problem that I face a lot in my regular day-to-day life, and something that I wish somebody would be able to design something for, which is why I use the transit app, which has pretty good live crowdsourcing to figure out better time tracking. Another one might just be bad website organization. Something that you might see this in a lot is with government documents or any kind of federal work that you have to get done, say trying to get your driver's license renewed. It can be really difficult to navigate a lot of these like DMV websites or a lot of the kind of federal websites that have really, really critical organization and which you need to access through a website. I will say, though, on the other hand, that the California DMV website is pretty good. It doesn't have too much of this problem, but obviously it would be an issue if it wasn't. So once you figure out these bugs and these pain points, you have the idea of this problem. You get a really good sense of what it is that is not working well, or that is missing, or that is gone from somebody's routine. And then you can translate that into unmet needs, that idea of what it is that is missing, not just the problem itself. So if we think about the problem of no internet, that pain point, the unmet need there is having access to internet, or just being in a space with faster internet, or even just having a different way to call into that work meeting. And when you go into this process of turning bugs into unmet needs, you start to figure out multiple solutions that might be possible. Like again, in this instance, the problem could be the internet connection, or I could solve the problem of you trying to watch this recording for class by holding an alternate in-person course or not requiring any kind of internet at all for this class. It could also mean you having access to, say, a place like a public library that has reliable internet for free for anybody to use. So that's all we have to say about user research for this course. We know that it's not a super deep dive, but it is something that we want you to explore on your own time, and learn a little bit more about what it is to empathize with users. We didn't talk about this too much in the slides that I just said, but the idea of empathy is the most important and the core thing at all of these instances of user research methods. Once you've gone through user research and talked a little bit more about the design process, one of the things that you can do later on to corroborate those ideas that you have is conducting user testing. That's going to allow you to verify and test those solutions that you started to come up with. So at this point, if we're doing user testing, we're a little bit further down the line. You've already gone into the prototyping stage. You have an idea and a working model of something that you want to create, maybe in Figma, maybe in something else. Once you're here and you have something that you can put in front of other users, you can conduct this kind of user testing to figure out the need of your design and the functionality of your prototype. This often involves just observing how people interact with those prototypes, and you can gain insight on the effectivity of your solution, things that need improvement, stuff that, for example, made a lot of sense to you in the moment, but isn't making sense to users. This also helps to validate your ideas about those pain points to figure out if you've identified them correctly, and if not, or if there's a better way to go about doing it, different ways to ideate to solve that particular problem you're trying to solve. A couple of quick methods of user testing are concept testing, where you can create very lo-fi prototypes of initial concepts to test. These can often also just be illustrations. Like in this example, you just have what looks like packaging for different kinds of flower seeds that are done in illustrations that are bare bones enough that they didn't take too long to create, but also detailed enough that you can get an idea of what this kind of packaging might look like. So this is something that you could do with, say, if you're making a piece of clothing, it's something you do with muslin. Like it's a little bit of a cheaper material or something that is a little bit easier, low fidelity, like we talked about in a previous lecture, that you can make at low cost to show to a lot of different people. Another thing you could do is A/B testing, which you might see a lot on websites. I know recently Wikipedia just released a new layout or for the UI that I had been like A/B testing on, or like been tested on me. I had multiple Wikipedia tabs open one day and I realized that about half of them had this new kind of layout with the table of contents to the side, while half of them still had the table of contents up at the top in the traditional Wikipedia layout. A/B testing is something we're going to talk a little bit more about in depth in just a second as well. And then the third thing that you could do is focus groups. So kind of parallel to what we talked about with interviews, where you get to interact more one-to-one with different people. You could also do a focus group and as a way of doing user testing, where you gather opinions and ideas from a larger group of users on a particular topic. Sorry, my timer just went off. But in this case, you could say you're working with a snack company who's just made a new kind of snack or a new kind of drink. You could invite a focus group who's been trying out this food for a particular amount of time, and then once they've um, all experienced it for a certain period, you could talk to them more in depth about their experience with that particular product that it is that they're using. So again, the idea of A/B testing, I talked about Wikipedia just now, but this is also a common example used with Netflix, where Netflix shows pretty much show different thumbnails to like a lot of different viewers. Like even in one account, if you have multiple different profiles, they could all be getting different images for a particular show that is popular right now. So one example that people like to bring up is Stranger Things, where Stranger Things can be categorized as a lot of different genres based on whatever it is that you are looking at. So if you look at something like maybe this middle one with the hand-drawn look of this, I didn't watch Stranger Things. I don't know what that is. But this hand-drawn monster, that feels a little bit more classic horror. It kind of has that scary stories to tell in the dark feeling. It has that Twilight Zone feel. If you look at the one all the way to the right with the two characters on it, again, sorry, I did not watch Stranger Things. This might be more of something that feels like a high school drama or even like a rom-com or romance, if it has that kind of plot in it. If you look down at this one on the bottom left, it feels a little bit more like popular horror stories, giving that feeling of like something in your closet, something that is unfamiliar to you, like classical horror that isn't quite the same as that hand-drawn feeling. Netflix was essentially going to be able to figure out what it is that you are attracted to on their streaming site, shows that you already watch and that you already regularly consume. And then based on that, figuring out what the best kind of thumbnail would be to show you. And they can figure out what is best by A/B testing these in front of other users. They get a variety of different thumbnails to put in front of different people. And then based on their click rate and their personal profiles, it'll determine what people seem to be responsive to and what thumbnail might be the best one to use for Stranger Things. Some phrases that you might hear a lot as you're going through the design world and you're learning a little bit more about design is the word usability testing. User testing and usability testing are kind of like a square is a rectangle kind of deal. Usability testing is a type of user testing, but not necessarily vice versa. So user testing, again, is the general idea of figuring out the need, demand, and effectiveness of a product that you have, figuring out your target users and how they're going to be using that product. Usability testing, more specifically, is a form that narrows us down into the idea of functionality and usability. How easy is it for users to navigate the thing that you've created? Does your interface make any sense to users? Are there things that can be fine-tuned to make it a little bit more effective to people? So some forms of usability testing, because this is going to be very important as you're working with kind of UI UX work, because the most important thing in those is the ability for people to interact with them, are these four. So first click is where you're able to track where users first click on an interface. This is something like, hey, I'm going to throw this landing page at you. What do you think is the call to action here? So this example has some app called Hotjar, and you see this general heat map area under or over this pink button. I'm not actually sure if you can see my mouse right now, which is why I'm describing stuff. But you see this, and that means that most users have clicked on this. So this is using some kind of software that is able to navigate or heat map the places that people click in a particular screen, which is why you see this kind of visualization. Next is just simple screen recording. This doesn't require any additional software for the most part. If you're doing this on a phone, you can just screen record it locally, but you can use any kind of software to remotely record users who are using your prototype. This is really helpful and probably more helpful than first click, especially if you are on a computer where they can see the places that your mouse is going without even needing to click on something. This is a kind of user testing or usability testing that I've personally conducted before as well. And being able to watch somebody's thought process as they're using something is surprisingly helpful, especially given the way that you don't normally think about how you're using something. The 5-second test is what it sounds like. It asks what information a user can recall after they've looked at something for 5 seconds. So, if I was to go to this slide, there's a lot to take in here. Maybe it's been about 5 seconds now. What might you be able to recall? The big things are probably the content, maybe the general layout, the fact that there are two sidebars. But there's not a lot, and you need that first impression to be effective, depending on whatever it is that you're creating. And finally, one of the most fun things that I think you can do is the paper prototype, where you can make physical paper prototypes of your product or interface and observe with users interacting with it. So even though we're doing Figma and we're learning all of this digital stuff, knowing how to do something like this can be both really fun and really helpful. The idea with a paper prototype of something like an app or a website is to have these different screens that you can kind of replace physically as people interact. So in this example, you see that there's this phone cutout that has this main sign-in page, but you also have the other screens that they can say, hey, if you click on the submit button, it'll move you into the screen. You can physically give them that piece of paper and see how they would react. This is a little bit more tangible and like another step forward in the idea of screen recording and first click, but it gives it a sense of like playfulness. And I think that idea of play can be really interesting in usability testing as people are more willing to engage with what it is that they're looking at. Remember also that this whole idea of the design thinking process is very not linear. These two steps we've talked about today fit into different places in this process, where traditionally what you might do is conduct a bunch of user research, figure out your problem, go into prototyping, go into like the design work part of it, do a bit of user testing, and then probably cycle back. Think a little bit more. If you find out in user testing that the direction that you're going in does not seem to be working, that might be a good time to go back to user research. If you hit a wall with something that you're building where you can't quite figure out what it is that's not working, doing user testing might be a way to unclog yourself and figure out how to move forward. User testing, again, revealing key insights that might prompt you to redefine that problem. That's okay. It is okay to not figure out things exactly right the first time. In fact, it is much rare that that ever happens. And so if you ever are in the process and you feel like you need to go backwards or go to a different step, that is more than okay. Cool. That's all for our kind of conceptual stuff for today. I'm going to pause the recording for just a second. And I know that this is not a live lecture, so I can't do the whole, if you have any questions, like write them in the chat. But you can always in our Slack ask questions in random or in ask, and I will always try to get to them when I can. Awesome. So with that, we're going to move into the more technical part of today, where we're talking about vector networks and the pen tool. So we've thrown around this term a couple of times throughout the course. We've talked about Figma being useful as a vector graphics software, but what do we actually mean when we say that, right? Vector graphics essentially are a way of displaying graphics on a computer using a bunch of math. So you go into whole ways of thinking about geometry and ways of thinking about linear algebra to create smooth lines, curves, and shapes. And what this means essentially in the software itself is that you can resize images that are vectors without losing quality or making things become quote unquote pixelated. In contrast, applications like Photoshop, Procreate, Clip Studio Paint, that kind of thing, they create raster graphics. Anything that you think of as digital painting software, this is going to function more as things like groups of pixels with a fixed resolution, so that when you are trying to scale them up or down, they lose a little bit of their quality. You see this kind of jagged edge that happens if I were to resize an image that is rasterized versus if I were to resize something that's vectorized, I wouldn't have any of that issue. And again, that is the idea of using math and equations to figure out the trajectory of these lines as opposed to just having pixels that are placed in a certain point of your screen. So what do you actually think that vector graphics look like? Well, there's not a quick answer. It is not an art style. It is simply a method and a medium. And the way that you might say that you like to do oil painting as opposed to using acrylic paint, you're using a different medium that can help inform the visual style of it, but is not definitive, right? Oil painting can look like a lot of different things, just like how vector graphics can also look like a lot of different things. So all of these images that we have here are examples of art that was created in like a vector graphics software. Most of these are probably made in Illustrator. Some of them might be in Figma. But all of these can be made through vector graphics. They obviously all look a little bit different, minus the idea that all of them have these kind of clean, smooth lines and shapes. Fun fact, the middle two are actually made by staff members. So in Figma itself, in order to create vectors and vector networks, You can use the pen tool, and Figma's pen tool, I'd say, is pretty unique and feels a little bit different from something like Adobe Illustrator's pen tool. So there might be a little bit of learning curve, even if you're already familiar with using the pen tool. You can access it with the fountain pen icon in the toolbar or with the shortcut P. In these slides, I'm going to be talking, lecturing at you, I guess, about how to actually use the pen tool and all the different kind of features and knickknacks that exist inside of it. And then we're going to go into a demo and play along with me. In this file itself, if you have a copy of the slide deck, you can go to the demo section. You might not have this whole bottom example, but I'll just be using this as a starting point to kind of chat more openly about how vector networks work. Anyways, when you click on the pen tool in Figma, you're going to see that the workspace enters something called vector edit mode. The whole toolbar at the top changes, and then it selects a new vector layer. This entire mode in Figma restricts you to a different set of tools, and is where you create vector networks, which I've said now a couple of times, but all you need to know is that that's what Figma calls vectors. They're called a network because it's just a whole set of points and lines and curves that exist within one space and are considered one vector. But if you actually look at it, it's really more than one object because there are more vectors and there are more points, sorry, that exist within that particular object. So just going into here, just to have a little bit of space for us to play around, I'm going to click on the pen tool from up here and then make, like, let's say a star shape. So I will go here. Let's make this 5-pointed star. It doesn't have to be perfect at all. And as I'm doing this, you can see that the whole toolbar has changed. I'm going to click done so you can see what it normally looks like. We have all of these different icons. But again, when I press P and then I start clicking somewhere, that whole thing changes. The middle section is gone. And we're replaced with just the selection tool, pen tool, a bend tool, and a paint bucket that we're going to talk about later. I also have this layer named vector 140 selected. And as I add new lines to it, let's make a triangle and I click done. We can see that the icon for the vector actually becomes a little preview of what the shape itself looks like. Now, this star, even though it had 5 distinct points that I clicked down, is one singular object that I can move, I can resize it, I can change different properties about it, like the stroke. And the same idea goes for this triangle, which is now one object that I control as if it is one piece. Something else to note is that once you've entered vector edit mode, anything that you do will be constrained to that one network and therefore that one layer, that one object. Even if the points are not connected, if they're very far apart, like here I have this here and there, this is all one network, even though they are very visibly different sections. So let me do the same thing here. Let's make this triangle, and then let's go all the way over here and make another triangle. And let's go all the way up here and make another triangle. This looks like it's 3 things, but you can see that they're all part of vector 141. And when I click done, they are all going to move as one thing. If I just want to select this triangle, there's no way for me to do it here. What I would have to do is actually re-enter vector edit mode. We talked about clicking vectors. So just looking at this GIF, you can see that when you place a node, it has these small blue line circles. And then if you click a node that closes the shape like here and like earlier, the line that you drag out is not going to be connected anymore. But another thing here, when we go into editing vectors with those 3 triangles that I want to separate, you can enter a previously created vector network by re-entering vector edit mode by either double-clicking into a particular vector, which can be a little bit finicky if the lines are short, or you can just click edit object here in the top toolbar, and then you're back into this particular network, and I'll delete this triangle and press enter. Or if I'm back here, instead of clicking on this button, I can just press enter one more time. Now I've entered back into it, I can delete this and click done. And now I'm restricted back to just this one triangle from earlier. In order to delete nodes and segments like I was doing earlier, all you have to do is press, sorry about that. All you have to do is press backspace, and that'll delete anything like you might expect it to. So we talked a couple of weeks ago about the shape tool and the idea of smart shapes in Figma. When you use any kind of shape tool, what you're effectively doing is creating a preset vector network. You can then edit any of those shapes by clicking on vector edit mode again and then manipulating the points how you like. But again, this idea of smart shapes is not necessarily going to keep working if you've decided to edit an existing vector. So here, I'm going to make a star. This normally has all those fun properties like changing the number of points and things like that. But once I've messed with it, you're not going to be able to do that anymore. Just to prove this point a little bit more, let's go ahead and make a square. Let's have a rectangle. I'm going to hold shift and make sure it's a square. All this is a preset vector network. It is called rectangle, but if I go in here and click on edit object, it's going to function just like any other network. I can mess with it however I want. And then click back in out of vector edit mode. And is still called rectangle, but is effectively just a unique vector that I've created. Stroke properties are going to be really helpful in doing any kind of outlines and things like that. You've already seen me change the thickness of the stroke as shown earlier. But all you need to know is that this information is stored in the right part of the sidebar. So you can have these three main things of color, point, and alignment, along with more advanced details like the cap, join, and if you want dashes. So we'll go ahead and just play with this here. I'm going to click on the star, drag this over to here. The main information is here. I have the color that I can change just like anything from the past. The alignment, like we've talked about before as well. If I go to outside, you see that the star actually has all those interior lines gotten rid of. If I say inside, there's this kind of weird feature that's happening here, right? It's trying to figure out what inside means for different points in the star, especially when it overlaps. Let's actually go in here and play around with this. If I were to move this point, you can see how that insideness affects the way that the star is shaped. And if I were to make this say outside, you're also going to see a lot of strange properties here, like how the way that that point kind of emerges when I'm going through this. You might also see this property that we're seeing right now where the corners are going to sometimes disappear if the angle is a little bit too sharp. Like if I go to here and I have outside selected, the angle is just too sharp. The point is going to go extremely far out. So Figma has just elected to forego that entire corner itself. If I go to center, it'll sometimes just truncate the tip of it until I get to a certain point and it decides to reappear. So if you're getting that effect, that's probably why it's happening. And it's also something that you can avoid if you change the join. If I make this the cap join or the bevel join, some of the corners are going to change a little bit, as you see here. This particular corner goes from being a sharp to a kind of cut off bevel. And then if I round out the corners, it's going to do kind of what you expect. It won't do it at a certain angle because these are too sharp. It's not going to be doing it. But if I bring these in a little bit more and I select all of the nodes by clicking and dragging, I can make all of these a little bit more rounded. And as we go in, you see that they've all softened up. The way that it was changing earlier was because I only had one selected. You can tell it's selected because the node itself is going to flip. It's now a blue circle with a white outline instead of a white circle with a blue outline. And then I want to change it back to being a different angle type. Just by clicking on that one, you see that nothing else is changing, only that one. Let's also talk now a little bit about this dashed line property. So I'm going to press P again. I'm going to make this line, and then I'm going to exit out of it. These two things are the caps. Let me set this to be a little bit thicker so we can actually see what's going on. The caps can be set to round or square. They're currently by default none. And if I go into square, what you're going to see is that it'll jut out a little bit past where that dot is. Whereas if I change it to round, it's going to still jut out, but be rounded at the end, which is going to be helpful if you're at any kind of thickness higher than like 1. I can also add these kind of arrow ends that are a little bit more unique. I will sometimes use these, but I think more frequently I will try to just make these shapes myself because they aren't always at the exact alignment that I want. As you can see here with stuff like the circle and the diamond, they're centered around the end of this line, not at like the tip of it. So as I move these, you're going to see that the center stays there. Let's also talk a little bit about that dashed line, where if we click on these 3 dots to get to the more advanced settings, you're able to actually make a dotted line by clicking dash. This is going to give you the number of pixels that you want each dash to be. So if I say I want the dashes to be 10 pixels long, it's going to be very, very short, versus if I want them to be 60 pixels long, it's going to be very, very long. And then I can actually manually change the gap between them. By normally it's going to be kind of 1-to-1 ratio, but I can make this dash a lot more aggressive by having it be a shorter gap, or I can make it very, very segmented by having it be a really long gap with a really short dash. Cool. The paint bucket and fill tool are going to be very helpful if you're doing any kind of illustration or graphics. Figma recently-ish released a new feature that lets you make one particular vector have multiple colored fills, which is very, very exciting. So let's go and try to make our own example of this, of just having like a stained glass window kind of effect of a lot of different shapes that are constrained within one vector network. So let's go ahead and make a rectangle like we did before, and then enter vector edit mode. Let's get rid of the fill and add a stroke that is 10 pixels wide. If I go to vector edit mode now, changing this to center, I can add a bunch more points into this particular rectangle. All I have to do is click in here and then just keep clicking, adding more parts to the stained glass window effect that we're trying to do. And clicking along this line to make sure that everything is nice and set up into segments that are all actual real valid segments. If I were to click here and to go here somewhere over here, this part, this triangle is not considered one valid segment, I believe. Oh, never mind. Figma updated and it's now smart enough, but you'll see is that if I were to click here, there is not a node that exists at this corner, but once I've clicked on this, it now does add a node so that I can manipulate this section by itself more independently. Let's delete that. Let's open up a few new segments just to get this point across. Let's have this cross over here. There's not a dot here, but if I start filling in any of these four, it will add a node. All right, so the fill, let's make this kind of rainbow colored. We've got this one fill going on. Let's select this one and make it darker. Let's select this one and make it yellow. But the gist here is that you can fill any particular shape on this vector itself and then change the color as you go. If I make this white, I can make this one black, and then we'll make this one blue. So this is one shape, right? It's one vector network. It's still called rectangle 149, but you can see it contains 10 different colors inside of it. This is a great way to go about doing any kind of illustration to make one large shape and then break it up into the different colors that you need for it. Again, I did all of that by accessing the paint bucket tool, which does not exist when you're in the normal toolbar. But if I were to go here and press enter, I can get to the paint bucket tool by pressing B for bucket. This is also going to let me clear any of these sections. So if I clear this, I can get rid of different colors. I can get rid of different sections that I actually don't want to be visible. And you've seen that the selection colors are now greatly decreased. If I then want to go back and add one, it'll probably just pick one of the colors that we've had before. And then I can still manipulate this as I need to. I'm going to click done. And then now we have this whole vector network that has some see-through parts, which we can exemplify by making sure that it is in fact see-through. Let me move this over. You can see that there's parts that are just have no fill on them. And there's parts that do. Cool. The selection tool I've been using this whole time within the vector edit mode itself, but as you might notice, you can select loads and line segments and then do the same kind of things that you can do with the selection tool normally, which is specifically things like using Alt and Option to duplicate, and then also doing things like Shift H and V to flip something horizontally and vertically, which I do a lot when I'm actually normally doing vector illustrations. And with all that said, we can go ahead and try it a little bit more than we have already, just by going into this demo section that we have here. This is something that we're going to talk about in just a little while. But first, I'll just go into I'll go into a little bit of this, and then we can talk about how this might work. So actually, apologies, I keep changing my mind here. We're actually going to talk about the next section before we dive into this, but all these little demos, if you weren't already doing them as I went, I would highly encourage that you play around with these tools before we continue to move on. So getting a little bit more in depth about the pen tool, the main thing that you might be wanting to figure out how to do is making curves. You've only made straight lines, which really restricts what you're able to do with vectors. So we'll be talking today about bezier curves, which is a fun French word. This is my ethos about this class. I no longer use Adobe Illustrator. I just use Figma. I know that there are things that you can't do in Figma that you can do in Adobe Illustrator. But I argue that the Bezier curves in Figma are good enough that I don't need to open Illustrator anymore. Anyways, if you've already used it, you might already be familiar with what a Bezier curve is, or if you've taken a class like CS184, which I'm in right now, also talks about Bezier curves. So originally, these are curves that were used to design cars in the 1960s, named after this French engineer. But now we can think of them as a way to create smooth and scalable curves. So again, the idea of vector networks being lines that are made up with a lot of math. This is a way that you're going to be able to preserve all of those curves, no matter what resolution you're at or no matter what size you're at. For our intents and purposes, you can just think of them as a term for vector curves. Bezier curves are made up in Figma of a couple of different pieces that we're going to be able to examine here. They all are generally made by paths. These are going to appear as these thin gray lines that you see throughout your file. They have the same nodes and selected nodes as a normal point, but they also have the addition of these handles. The handles show up as like tangential or just at the edge of those curves, and they dictate how curvy a curve is. You're going to be able to manipulate the angle and like the sharpness of a given curve. It's generally going to be a pretty trial and error process to learn how to best control these and to get the kind of muscle memory and feeling for it, even if you're already familiar with them in a different tool. But we have a lot of practice today in the lab that you're going to be doing as well as in the homework, just to figure out how to get the hang of Bezier curves overall. So when you're adding vectors, you're going to see that vector panel in the top sidebar, sorry, the right sidebar. Again, that metadata that shows about all of these different things. The most important thing that has been added that you want to take note of is this mirroring option. These are the handle settings. The handle settings can be set to no mirroring, mirror angle, or mirror angle and length. And what this is those two halves of that particular handle. If you have these set to be mirror angle and length, like you see in this particular example, that curve is going to be really, really smooth. The curviness of it is going to be the same on both sides of that node. In contrast, if you set it to say no mirroring, this only applies to one side, and the other is completely independent, which often means that it's a sharp corner, or you can have it be mirror angle, where the curve is kind of smooth, but might vary on the two sides. Intersecting nodes is something that we actually interacted with earlier, or sometimes you might want to connect multiple line segments. Just making overlapping passes and do this automatically. And so you're going to be wanting to click on different parts of the nodes to intersect them. And again, you can think of these with each path like being an individual piece of thread, where anytime you add a node, what you're kind of doing is tying it together or making that like a clicked point that adds like a new end to the thread on your canvas. If you want to learn a little bit more about vectors, I would strongly recommend that you check out Figma's Figma in 5 videos that talk about vectors in vectors 1 and 2. You can find these on YouTube very easily, but just by looking up Figma in 5 vectors 1. And this is going to really up your game on how to do vectors effectively. So with all of that, I want to actually dive straight into this demo where we talk a little bit about a previous illustration that I've done. This is not going to be necessarily accessible to you, but if you want, I would strongly encourage that you just follow along or just listen and figure out, the way that we approach vectors. So this whole illustration that I have here is just something that I made in Figma a while ago that I thought was a good example of vector curves. All of these different things are assets that I made with the vector edit mode in Figma itself. We can take a look maybe specifically at this chandelier. So I'm going to drag out a copy of it. There's a lot of different layers going on here. I'm going to delete this outline, but I want you to take a look at what this is. I added this kind of cartoony effect with these black outlines by making a copy of the entire thing and then making it a vector. You can see that this has the setting to be outside, so it kind of gives like that sticker effect where if I put this over here and made it white, this is kind of what a sticker of this particular illustration might look like, but it's a little distracting, so for now we're going to delete it. This entire central piece right here, the chandelier front, this is one vector network. We can move it out again to make it a little bit easier to see. I'm going to make a duplicate of it and drag this all the way out. And if I go into vector edit mode, we can take a look at what the handles here look like, right? So I've got this very smooth looking curve right here. If I click on this node, I'm going to be able to see its handles along with the handles of the nodes that are the next, like previous and next in line on the path. This has a mirrored angle where if I change the length here, if you see, I'm going to hold shift to make sure that I don't move. The curve-iness of that particular thing is going to stay pretty consistent. But the more that I move this handle out, the further that it is. If I click just on this handle, oh my goodness.
If I click on this handle, you can see how it's going to affect that half of the line and makes it a little bit more aggressive. If I were to go here where the curve is quite curved, or if I make it less so, it's not going to be there at all. And if I even delete this handle, there is just now a sharp corner on one side, which obviously looks a little bit strange. But here you can see what that might look like if I were to delete these as well. So playing with these handles and these Bezier curves is the best way to go about doing this. Just looking at this, you're not going to get a lot of experience. You're not going to figure out necessarily how to do this. But with some trial and error, you can do something like this with, I think, relative ease. Let's take also a look at this flower that's going on here. I can drag this out. This is actually an old kind of version of the way that you do things in Figma. But something that I did here is make 3 of the same vector, but have them all be a different color. This is before Figma released multiple fills in one vector. But you can see the way that I've had um, only parts of a vector filled in. So if I were to go into this vector, you see that it has all 3 parts of this tulip, but only certain sections of it are filled in, which is why you get this effect of 3 items coming together to make one particular flower. So this example is, again, probably not in your slides, but I would take a look at it in this video to see the way that all of this is made within Figma. One other thing that I want to note is the idea of mirroring that we've talked about before. So let me take this out one more time. And let me grab this chandelier front from here. I'm going to make a copy, Control C, and then Control V out here. This is perfectly symmetrical. So what I did to make this was just delete all of this. Let's pretend none of this is real. And then I can select all of this, copy it, or I can do Hold Alt. And when I hold Alt and hover over this, you see that my cursor becomes this duplicate cursor. Click and drag, bring it all the way over here, and then do Shift H to flip it horizontally. Now I have this whole second segment that I can select all of this and then connect it in here. And I want to make sure that it's touching it. Oh my goodness, it's touching at the bottom. Sorry. I'm going to turn on the stroke. I have all of this selected. I'm going to bring this in, drag it to make sure it's touching at the very bottom there. These points are now all connected. So what I can do is go up to the top, press P, and then do this. And now the entire thing is filled in. Again, I can change this fill however I want to make it a different color. I can delete the stroke. But that's how I made perfectly symmetrical illustrations in Figma's vector edit mode. Cool. The last thing we're going to talk about today, it is a pretty short lecture, is masking and Boolean operations. These are things that you can play around with and figure out on your own, but we just want to talk through them and make sure that you know that they exist. So masks are a way of showing or hiding certain parts of layers like shapes, using shapes, kind of like a stencil, or if I were to, cut out a piece of paper and place it over something else. So any shape group Boolean can be used as a mask, and in Figma, the shape of the bottommost layer will be considered the mask for the entire group. All other areas outside the mask are in layers that are in layers above the mask are going to be kind of hidden around the edges. So in this example, you're using a mask to crop this image. We have a circle mask that we put underneath the image to say that this is the only part that's going to be visible. So we use masks with these basic steps. What you can do is first take the image that you want, then create the shape of the mask that you want to apply to it, no matter what that is. If it's a circle, rectangle, star, whatever it is that you need to be that shape. Move this shape to be underneath the image and then press the mask option here. So let's actually do that because that didn't make any sense when I just said it out loud. Let's pick an image from my computer. I'm going to grab this picture that is the Stregonona book cover because I think it is cute. And then I want to say, let's just make this a star mask. So let's make a star. Let's edit it to have all the properties that I wanted to have. Let's make it a little bit rounded. Let's make it a little bit chunkier so it's nice and cute and kind of matches the stars at the edges. And then I'm going to put this over Stregonona right here and then drag that star to be underneath. So let's do that. I'm going to select both of these layers and then click on the mask option. Oh my goodness, that didn't do it at all. It is entirely possible that Figma updated. It did not update either. So Let's take this. Oh, I know what's going on. Okay, it's just these two. Let's have the star go underneath capture one. That's what's going on. And now we have this mask hang happening. What I was doing earlier was accidentally selecting this rectangle up here instead of the right shape. So let's make this a little bit more meaningful. I'll name this Strega Nona and name this, oh my goodness, star mask. So now I have this mask that is star shaped. I can give it, I think, oh, I can't do that. I can't give it a stroke. I can give it a little bit of a stroke by setting it to outside. What we see here is that that's not actually a visible stroke because I'm adding it to this mask group. If I actually wanted there to be a stroke on the outside of this entire thing, what I would need to do is make a copy of this mask. I'm pasting it here, and then making this no longer a mask by clicking here. You see it's gone from having this kind of crescent shape to having the original icon that it had before. And now if I had a stroke, I'm actually going to be able to see it. The reason why I didn't do it earlier when I was affecting this is because you're treating that object like a mask and like just its shape. The object itself is not really going to be visible anymore if it's being used as a mask. It can't do both things. So that's how we do that. Well, you can also have multiple layers be selected to be masked. So if I were to say want to put little stars inside of this image that are still going to be cut off when I need them to be cut off, let's actually just do circles because it's a little bit easier. I can add these circles here. Let's make this the orange of her shirt. Let's add another circle down here. That is going to be the yellow part of her shirt. This does not make a lot of sense in the context of this image, but what I can do is take these two and just drag them directly into the mask group. And now their edges are going to be cut off. See, so this whole circle is only visible in the part that is inside of the star mask. Same goes for here. Cool. That's all we have to say about masking. It can take a little bit of a challenge to figure out how exactly to do them. The main thing that you want to keep in mind is that Figma does do the dirty work here of showing you exactly what is being masked. So the very bottom layer is the shape of the mask. Everything above it inside the arrow section is the content of that mask. So playing with this here, moving on to Boolean operations, which we do actually have a demo for in the demo section of the file if you go ahead and follow along. There are four main Boolean operations that let you set up a combination of shape layers in different ways. If you're familiar with computer science, you might know that Booleans are like kind of yes or no or true or false. And the idea here is going to be the same is if you have two objects where it's like the and or not XOR kind of deal, what parts of those two objects are you showing? There are four Boolean operations in Figma that you're going to be able to see. Union, subtract, intersect, and exclude. I will be honest, I don't normally remember the names of these, but it's something that you're going to be able to see in the icons here. So the Booleans basically tell you how, excuse me, how two objects are going to interact when you've decided to connect them. The first here in union is going to be show all of both of those shapes. So if I click into here, if I actually expand this out, you can see that I have two distinct squares, the first one being here and the second one being here. Because they've been unionized, you can see all of both of them. If I move into subtract, you can actually see that there are two of the exact same squares, but the top one, the second one, is being subtracted. If I were to move this around, different parts of the top one are going to be subtracted. And important thing to note is that this is not just a white square. If I change the background of this to be any other color, the same part of it is going to be moved around and gotten rid of. It's not just a white square that's being placed on top of it. Intersect is the same idea here, except you're only going to see the overlapping part. This is the Venn diagram version. If I make this part bigger, you can see how all of that is going to change. And then exclude is the opposite of that. It's the Venn diagram, but only the outside parts that are not overlapping. So any part that is overlapping is going to actually be gone. And this makes a very interesting kind of optical illusion-y effect. I'm sure that the color I selected for the background is not helping. But let's go ahead and change that back to white. Just making sure there's nothing else on these slides, but an important thing to note is that anytime you use Boolean operations, they treat it as one shape, which means that the stroke is going to go around the edge of the entire thing, even though technically speaking, these two squares are still fully separate and exist within this particular union or this particular Boolean. So as I move this around, you can see that that edge is going to actually move around with it. The stroke functions as if this two image thing or this two shape thing is actually just one shape. Um, I mostly just find this to be a very fun and cool effect to play with, but there are a lot of practical use cases of this in design work that you need to do, particularly any kind of like illustration work. This is going to be really helpful for you as well. But with that, that is essentially all for today. This is a pretty short lecture, and we're going to be talking about stuff in a little bit more depth next week. But this is something that is very difficult to learn when you're being lectured at. So the majority of what you're learning with vector networks is going to be happening in your lab this week. So speaking of which, this week's homework and lab are particularly helpful if you really want to learn how to do these vector illustrations. We know that this is not necessarily for everyone. Not everybody wants to do a lot of intense illustration. That said, having a basic knowledge of how to do things like this is helpful for, say, if you need to make some icons, or you just need to do a very, very basic graphic. So given that, homework 4 is recreating a messenger sticker. What you're going to be doing is tracing. Tracing is, I think, the best way to practice any kind of illustration. We want you to take a messenger sticker from Facebook or really any kind of basic vector graphic, and try to make a copy of it by tracing over it in Figma itself. The lab is a set of very detailed exercises that are going to give you some exposure and practice with those pen tool things. This week, I'm assuming that nobody is really going to be doing the homework before the lecture, especially. So do make sure to do this, the homework before the lab. So do make sure to do this lab before you start the homework to make sure you get a little bit of practice. And something else to note is that we're going to make the homework due on Tuesday like we did this week. So the secret word for today, something that might be appropriate, given that we talked about this illustration here, is the word chandelier. So the secret word would be chandelier, spelled like this, which I'm pretty sure is correct. Make sure you input that for today's secret word on the attendance form. And then some basic announcements are just to keep an eye out for the homework, the lab. And again, the readings are always going to be there. We're going to talk about user research and testing this week. But that should be all. Next week, we're going to be talking about prototyping and accessibility. I think it's one of the most fun weeks of the class. And we are going to be in person in Jacobs 310. If you're auditing, you're more than welcome to come join us. And that's all for this week. Thank you so much for watching this recording. We're not going to be doing this very often, and I appreciate you staying up to date with the class. Thank you.